computer. I think we're recording. Howdy. So good to see you guys.
Thank you. Good to be here.
It's great to see everybody.
So why don't we just kind of start with like locating ourselves. I'm Vikki Reynolds, and I don't ever know what to say I am. I'm a therapist and I'm an adjunct prof, and I, try to shoulder up a whole bunch of teams and do that kind of work. And my pronouns are she and her, and I'm a white settler on the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I'm really excited to be in conversation with you, Parker and Sacha. I've been really looking forward to this.
My name is Parker Johnson, and I'm a 50-year-old African-American who arrived on these lands in 2002 as a settler who is descendant of stolen people on stolen land, or as some have been recently saying, looted peoples on looted land. And I am a consultant. I'm working in organizational change, do coaching, and my principal areas of focus are around justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in organizations and communities.
Cool.
Beautiful. I'm Sacha Médiné. I'm also, as I said, I struggle with exactly how to locate myself in some of these conversations, but I'm a counselor and also an adjunct professor, teaching counseling programs and do some organizational work as well in a variety of different spaces. And most of my practice is focused on engaging with folks who understand their struggle as being connected to being harmed by structures of violence and oppression. So especially in this moment, lots of work with Black folks, BIPOC folks more broadly. And I'm a Black man on unceded Coast Salish territory, and just coming to understand some of the language that Parker's using about my particular location, what it means to be in a Black body on these territories, what my particular path to this place means for what it means to inhabit these territories in a useful way. Yeah, and I'm excited to be in conversation with the two of you.
Well, this conversation started because I was kind of in conversation with the two of you individually about what could happen, what can we offer, in particular to Black people in these moments of struggle, and then I thought, oh, why don't we all just have a conversation together about it, because I imagine there's a whole bunch more people trying to figure out how do we do this, so yeah. Maybe Sacha, why don't you lay out kind of like what your call was to me, what you were looking for, what you're responding to, and I'm just thinking about you as Parker said, you're the tapped Black therapist. Everybody's like, oh, I've got a Black therapist, Sacha Médiné. We'll send them to Sacha. That'll fix this, and.
Yeah, my practice, I think, even speaking about it, feels there's a certain discomfort around it. But I think it's hard to know exactly how you're understood in community. But I think I'm a Black therapist who operates from an explicitly political lens, and there just aren't that many of us. I'm certainly not the only one. There are lots of really, not lots, but there are some other really brilliant Black therapists who are working with folks. But there is not enough of us, and there is not enough of me, especially to be in care of folks directly. And so when the deluge of sort of what feel like parallel forces of Black folks really needing more space to be held and to process, and needing more care, and then also this explosion in all of a sudden interest and awareness that anti-Blackness is a thing that exists on these territories, especially in two, not just on the other side of the border, that there is just not enough of me to be of use unless I'm able to be more strategic. And so I've been trying to think of ways to answer that call in a way that makes the most sense and is in the best use of my time and my resources. And I think one of the things that feels excited about this conversation is that I think I know for me, part of what that means is being a part of helping facilitate more conversations and bring more groups or community spaces together in different ways. And I think what feels especially honoring about being in conversation with the two of you, especially in this moment, is that both of you are folks who I experience and know have been facilitating difficult, complex, necessary conversations in a variety of different communities for a long time. And so I'm just appreciating the chance to be alongside you and to work through how it is that you do this.
Thanks for that. And Parker, what are you? You and I also
Yeah.
having similar conversations, because you're also the guy. We say, "Oh man, Parker Johnson's the guy." We'll get Parker in it. That'll do it, right?
Yeah. No, it's been interesting for me, because I generally try to be a person in the background, just doing stuff quietly and all that kind of thing. And so lately I've been trying to step up more and be present, doing that thing on CBC on racism. And then also there have been conversations, and I guess for me, it's been sort of a mix of focusing on Indigenous, Black, and people of color, particularly Black folks, and what's going on for us, and how people can be supported across all of these ways in which being, in a Black body manifests, and then also dealing with and interacting with non-Black people, other people of color, Indigenous folk, around liberatory work, because this is, on the stolen and occupied land of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. There's the enduring legacy of colonialism and living in a colonial state that's founded on and maintained by capitalism, patriarchy, and white supremacy. And so, knowing that people are in a state of urgency at all times, when COVID hit, it amplified already existing fissures, as many folks have talked about. And I've been privileged to be a part of some conversations where people have been trying to strategize on what needs to happen. And my contacting you in particular, Vikki, was, getting some of your insights and working with folks in trauma, but also facilitating what can be quite difficult conversations, because the heat of the trauma, and then people are also trying to strategize, and you're both trying to heal yourself while you're moving forward. And I mean, it's nothing new to struggle, but the amount of complexity now, I think, because people are getting saturated with media as well, and it's I think really quite difficult. And just as an aside for me, the filming of Black people being murdered, assassinated, lynched, tortured, brutalized, it's it's people oftentimes, I know, are having to do back away from the media just because there's a saturation point. And so there's that sort of layer underneath, myself included, dealing with it. You're dealing with the grief, the anger, the hope, all of those, that roller coaster of emotions that's going on with folks, and being able to honor those things in a space to give them, so that they don't end up, eating away at us. I've talked quite a bit, but so these are some of the challenges.
Yeah, thanks for that. Really appreciate that. And I'm thinking about, how you and I met. We met. I just liked your language. You said, Vikki, we got to talk about having some fierce conversations. We're going to have, not difficult or challenging, but we're going to have some hard, heartbreaking, fierce conversations. How are we going to do this? And I thought that's how you and I met.
Yeah.
You and I met when I was brought in as the quote kind of white ally person to try to challenge racism at a major educational institution. Man,
Yeah. Yeah.
over
And
20 years ago.
Yeah, and they just let go of their board chair at that particular institution because of some racist remarks that individual said in social media.
Yeah, and so that's how I met you. And one of the things that we were like remembering the other day is like, and I may have told you this, Sacha, like the only thing that was required, the only thing that was required of me is for me to, as a white person, get up with all the privilege I had and name racism and the fact that racism was not present in this major institution's plan for the future. It was their plan for inclusion, and it never said the word racism. That's how I started. It's the only thing I said, and every Black person and every person of color in the room was like, that's it. It's all we expected of the white person. You did your job. And I just thought, and we had there was a year working up to creating a frame where that could get spoken. And I remember thinking, holy shit, the bar is low on white people.
Mm-hmm.
Like that wasn't that, it means I can never teach there. There was other consequences. I mean, that's fine. Anyway, I was just thinking about that, Parker, like how much work, in particular Black people and people of color, had to do for me to be able to say that, for that to get said, and then how that got kind of held up as the courage in the room came from a white person. Like it was a tactic, but it also replicated the things we were trying to dismantle, which is like who would get to say what with what authority. Anyway, so we met in fierce conversations that were hard and imperfect and useful too, though. Yeah.
At that time, it was really important at that time, I think, particularly that institution where they chose not to hear what people had to say. Mm-hmm. And I think they're still challenged, like many institutions, to understand what systemic racism is. People use that language the way they use the word intersectionality without really interrogating what that means. And I encourage so many folks, why don't you read Me and White Supremacy? Have a little action guide moment with that. And it's a useful tool. Yeah.
But then I think when you hear the head of the RCMP say, and when I wish I had a video of this for any, my PhD is really on critical linguistics. There's a 30-second clip that explains everything. Pretty much she's white and she says, I'm not really sure what systemic racism is, but I'm pretty sure the RCMP doesn't have it. I was like, that was a perfect clip. And then you could have people do a PhD on taking that apart in terms of white supremacy, the use of language. Like, it's everything we need to know. We don't need an investigation. That's the whole investigation. Investigate that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Being a rhetorician and just doing a critical analysis of, it's like, okay, so you were birthed by colonialism and white supremacy, but you don't know that from which you emerged. Okay. And patriarchy.
Yeah. Well, and then they do the cute quote intersectional thing where they got a woman speaking to it, so somehow patriarchy is not present, which Bell Hooks teaches us, right? Feminism's for everybody, right? All genders can enact patriarchy. It's domination and control. Well, I'm just thinking, I just wanted to pick it up in terms of us talking about having a fierce conversation or courageous conversation. Can you maybe say something about what kind of conversations you're dreaming of or hoping of? What could these conversations that are happening now in Black community, what do you hope they could deliver,
Sasha, you want to?
Parker saying Sasha.
I've been flapping my jaw,
No, you're good.
I'm interested in hearing what you have to say, Parker. Again, like I feel like I'm just coming into understanding, even of being able to conceive of these things and trying to imagine what is possible. at least part that you were naming that felt so alive for me is that description of first naming what it is to be in this media space where, you know, every Black person I know is witnessing a snuff film every week, that we're having to carefully plan our media consumption, which is part of our activism around not witnessing a snuff film about our racialized murders. And what it is to carry that, and then what it is to carry whatever spaces we're holding. Like, I love that trying to heal while we're moving forward, because that's exactly what it is. That's exactly every conversation that I've been a part of with a Black person in my life has been trying to figure out what it is to do that, either personally or in terms of community. Yeah. And then I think, you know, I think one of the pieces that is, like, for both, comes up for both of you that I don't really know what to do with is, again, part of your description of dealing with the grief and the anger and the hope. And I used to think a bit about some of the stuff that Vikki has talked about like outing your rage. And like, that just feels like there's that has to be somewhere in there. And I don't know where it is, but yeah, I feel like both there are places that I really appreciate that both of you are trying to work through and have spent some time thinking through. And so, yeah, I'm curious where that goes for either one of you around that rage and that grief.
And I think, you know, on a personal level, I've been in a grief circle with some friends as the only Black person in the group. And I'm also, you know, a large Black person, and not unlike the ways in which I suspect I'm not living this. Women live within patriarchy and navigate that as a large Black man navigating white supremacy in public and personal spaces doesn't, particularly in this 6'3", 200+ pound frame, rage, even controlled rage, can create a sense of danger for those around me and for me at the same time. And so, you know, I live in a household with 2 women, daughter and partner, and you know, there've been moments where I've gotten really upset, and you know, I've had my daughter say, you know, Dad, you know, when you get really upset, I feel unsafe. I feel, you know, I don't feel comfortable, I guess the best way to describe it.
Mhm.
And so even when it's not, you know, directed at her, it's just, there's this large being in my household who's expressing, you know, distress. And so about being able to have those conversations, and, you know, walk that line of privilege and oppression and all the complexities that, you know, go with it. And being 58 has a, you know, another kind of thing going on as well. And so, you know, I read people, you know, people have things like gentle giant, and I'm like, so that means like you're a safe Black person, you know? So there's ways in which the coded language of
Yeah.
containment and control to satisfy the white gaze is implicated in our language. And for us to really be able to fully express ourselves, oftentimes we need to do that within community, in the absence of that sort of space, and recognizing that there's complexity there too, you know, person with disabilities, people with different ages,
Yeah.
people with different political views, all, you know, the range, people with different gender identities and expressions, religious backgrounds, you know, having Muslim folk, people who are atheists, you know, just, it's, yeah, the gamut that's there, and being able to have a space where people can be who they are without being policed, because that's what the Amy Coopers do. They're vigilantes. Although people don't characterize them as such, that's vigilante behavior.
Mhm.
And so the notion that white people feel deputized to police, surveil, threaten, and terrorize Indigenous folk, Black folk, and people of color. And I say that very intentionally because the targets of subjugation, in terms of racialized bodies in Canada are principally Indigenous and Black folks. And we see this through the systems of incarceration and containment. We see this through who gets pushed out of schools, even though Canadians choose not to collect the data. We look at the segregation practices, both in terms of unemployment, housing, people who can't find housing, what happens in healthcare, my being policed when I try to go into a store.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's the ongoing sort of incessant stuff that happens. And, you know, in the way in which it gets normalized in our bodies because we're navigating it all the time. And so for me, liberatory practice is removing these microaggressions, these sanctions and positions on our mind, body, and spirit, which seek to dehumanize us.
Yeah.
And to lay that bare and remove it. And, you know, people talk about joy as a form of resistance, you know, because even when Black people are joyful, there's the need to say, why are you so loud? Why are you so this? Why are you so that? So the need to be together and to be able to be in one's fullness is part of what liberation is, beyond and inclusive of some of the basic human rights aspects of it: food, clothing, shelter, right to be free of threat and terror from the state and from private entities that feel compelled to act as agents of the state.
Well, I'm just so I think this is the believed in hope that we can create a space where that can be spoken and not, as you say, subjugated to the white gaze, but also like what Judith Butler talks about is unspeakable acts. You know, you can't speak your rage, Parker. You gotta, you know, you've gotta, like if you're in this grief group and it's not Black people and you're in a big Black body, your experience is unspeakable. You're navigating the whole time. So I'm thinking about I was talking to two of you about, and I've been talking to a lot of Black people about lately, frankly, is about how can we like create some space where actually that which is unspeakable can be spoken, and not just spoken, like shouted and screamed. And I truly do believe in the need to outrage. You have to out your rage. And I've been thinking about Makuga Akinyala's work. Makuga Akinyala is a Black professor from Georgia. He's a therapist, and he talks about testimony work, that there needs to be a room for testimony. Not necessarily everybody doesn't need therapy, but how do we create a space in which you could actually hold each other up in testimony? And I think of Ken Hardy's work. Ken Hardy is also a Black American anti-racist therapist, professor, movement person. And he talks about the soul wound of slavery and the soul wound of anti-Black racism in the United States. So what I'm thinking about is, how do we create a space that can actually, how do we create a space where testimony can actually happen? We can, you know, where the soul wound of anti-Black racism can be addressed, and that where people can actually be invited to actually witness each other without needing to be mediated through like professionals, in particular white professionals or not Black professionals. And how can that speaking, you know, because I'm thinking about like what Judith Butler said from queer theory and critical trans theory, right? That's the unspeakable act. How could that speaking be itself more than liberatory, do the thing Parker's talking about, which is move us, be a movement, be a part of a movement, but also a part of healing, right? Like for, you know, and I actually believe my activism is my church. I was talking to my sister and I was saying the Black Lives Matter march on Friday on Juneteenth. I felt like she said, I said, it felt like I was in church, Nancy, the times that where it's sacred, like a sacred space. So, so I think about like structures of how we would structure that. That's the thing I'm kind of been thinking about. So this is what we're after, like how would we structure that? That's what I've been thinking about. Yeah.
I've been in some online communities where I've helped to co-facilitate some conversations. And I've also just participated in grief circles that have happened for just Black people.
Yeah.
And they've been Yeah, it's weird it's unusual and interesting to do them in sort of virtual spaces because, um,
Hmm. Hmm.
yeah, people are having these sort of shared experiences, but um, for me, one of the things that sometimes is missing is being able to have, breakout rooms, if you will, where people can take some questions and go in and do their work. And, also the sort of larger shared space, because the things that I've been a part of have generally been larger group conversations.
Yeah.
Was privileged to be a facilitator with a group of Black, queer, trans, non-binary folk.
Yeah.
Um, and you know, it was good to, be in the space, and help to hold the space. At the same time, I felt there was so much that was unsaid, so much longing.
Yeah.
And you can't really pick that up as easily energetically virtually. Um, but it was kind of there. But at the same time, you know that there were needs that were being met,
Yeah.
just in being in the space together.
Yeah.
Particularly for folks who live by themselves, or people who don't live by themselves but might not feel seen
Yeah.
and heard.
Yeah.
So that
Well,
witnessing is so vital, so important, and that was really a lot of what the space was about. Not so much creating some sort of shared catharsis, but a non-judgmental holding of whatever is real for a person at the time. Anyway.
no, but that's what I think about, right? Like I think about, so one of the things I said to both you and I've been saying to other people, I think it's really important if we're going to create these spaces for fierce conversations that have the capacity to outrage, to make space for outrage, if that's what has to happen, and for true witness. I think someone has to facilitate. There has to be it can't just be a group of folks agreeing to meet. I think someone has to come in and hold the space, and their job is the ethical care of everybody in the dialogue, in the conversation, and holding it so that everybody gets it. That's where you could feel on a cellular level, Parker, that you actually could out your rage, because Sacha's actually going to contain it, not contain you, just hold a space for you. And I think that, yeah, and that it's, that's, and it's, I think a Black person has to do that now. I don't think as a white person it's okay for me to do that. And that's what we were talking about. So I think someone's got to, it's hard to be the person who's trying to hold that space, but you're also going to be a Black man in that space, Parker. But I think about what we know from direct action activism. We can walk and chew gum. That's one of the teachings, right? You can hold that space and you can actually belong to that space. And I think that thing that would matter is having these really out loud spoken collaborative agreements for what we're doing here, and these agreements on that. So one of the intentions I would have is I would really want to honor everybody's autonomy. I don't want to tell people how to grieve, how to be angry, how to respond, but and that these are everything that I'll just lay out a bit now. Is that where we're at? I think. Yeah, all of this comes from communities of struggle. Most of these communities of resistance are communities that are Black, Indigenous, people of color, as problematic as that expression is. But also I've also learned from white people who are direct action activists and stuff. And but this idea that we try to do something that's absolutely not psychological or psychotherapeutic about this. It's not a behavior mod thing. It's not what are those things called, Sash? Like psychoeducational group. It's not that, right? You're both smiling because you've been attacked with that. How do we let's not hide behind professionalism and psychology's ideas about confidentiality. We don't want confidentiality. Confidentiality simplistically always says, oh, whatever's said in the room stays in the room. We don't want what's said in the room to stay in the room. So one of the things, a teaching from activism, direct action activism, is share the teaching, but don't appropriate the story. And I know as a white person, that's what white people do, is that appropriation of that story of the person, so that we take the teachings out. And then having agreements that we're going to have room for struggle, that's going to be held in attention with an invitation to accountability. So like Parker, if you're struggling with trans non-binary folks in this, like what you can bring that there, but if what you say starts to side with transphobia, we're gonna invite accountability collectively for that as well, right? So that room for struggle with accountability, so that people, that thing Sacha and I, we were talking about at the beginning before we got online about the work being an imperfection project, that people aren't silenced until they get it perfect. They have to be able to be in a place, there's no language. You know, Wittgenstein says the limits of my language are the limits of my world. There's no language for black rage in this moment that doesn't sound psychologically too high on the anger scale or too heartbroken on the depression scale, right? There's no language. So how do we, it's in these, I think in these dialogues that we can create new language, but we're gonna have to be able to struggle. And one of the things I often say is, let's just talk messy and we'll fix it. Let's not get it, like everybody talk messy and I'm gonna hold it and we're not gonna let anything oppressive happen and we'll make repair, you know? Because if we can only use the language we've got, we're not going anywhere new, right? Okay, and then I'm thinking about people's right to keep their own counsel, that everybody doesn't feel that they have to out their rage or they have to break their heart or they have to share that, you know, participation can some be being quiet witness. And that for many folks, you know, that languaging of silence, they might not be silenced. It might be an act of resistance. They might not want to take too much space. You know, they might lose their containment entirely if they start to talk. So they're doing everything they can and they're participating richly by also helping hold the space for others and getting outside of that psychology babble stuff that Sacha talks for 2 minutes, Vikki talks for, you know, where it's paint by number stuff. And then an agreement about not pathologizing. And this is so important in terms of how white supremacy has just permeated and is the structure of psychotherapy and of ideas about what's psychologically unwell, so that we're not going to start to make meaning of other people's experiences. If someone cries or rage or is brokenhearted, like, you know, that, you know, we're not going to police that. I think one of the things in this moment that we're called to do is to resist our own inner police, the ways that we're invited to cop each other and to like silence and bear witness when you start to cop each other, that's what's going to maybe make that public so that others can see they might be doing that too. Holding space for outing rage, holding space for like intense experience. I don't even want to call it emotion because it's more like an experience. And I think, and this is so much different than venting. You know, we don't want to create a space where people vent, especially when people vent and I like stare at Sacha and I talk to you the way a cop talked to me as a, you know, if I was a black person, and then I'm raging at you. Energy is real. And like you said, Parker, one of the things I have been feeling in these last couple of months on Zoom, if people are able to come with a real connective presence, we can defy the limits of the technology. You know, we need to do things like commit to each other. This is not just a Zoom meeting. This is actually a space we're creating. So don't turn your screen off. Don't get up and walk away. You know, bring your body and spirit to this. You should be able to, we can feel each other. We will feel each other across this. Don't multitask. Don't have your computer going. Don't have your phone on. Like, bring ourselves to that. And then thinking about how do we defy that venting, you know? And one thing I think about is when people are like speaking like that is ask people to speak about it, like in the third person, as opposed to like screaming at you, Parker, about how angry I am. Because that stuff is real, and I think it matters on a cellular level, even if you're not in the same room. And then this idea about witness, not gossip. There's this, especially when I'm thinking about like Butler's ideas about unspeakable acts, so much in the conversations I have had with Black people in the last couple of months has been people telling me things that are absolutely unspeakable until now and needing to find a space to speak it. And like I said, as a white person, I'm not the best witness. Who's the best witness for this? And that idea that we need to transform the language of Black rage into legitimized speech. And so when you say it with the right witnesses, it moves from unspeakable act to legitimate. This is, we're allowed to talk like this. You know, this idea of this is bearing witness to each other. We're not gossiping about anybody. We're not shit talking anybody. Like, people having the right to like say those kind of things. So I think about those as kind of more the like collaborative agreements that would create a frame or a structure that the person could bring. And, you know, a group could change, like the different person every conversation could be the one holding the space, but just as long as someone's holding the space. It's not a skilled professional spot. It's the, you know, that's the point guard, man. It's the person like kind of just like holding the space. I'm just thinking about any like reflections you had to that, or how did that sound?
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in, because there's so much of what both of you named that also felt like it built really nicely and has given more language to some of the stuff that's been bouncing around for me a bit. So I'm really grateful. Going right back to what you were talking about, Parker, that when you were talking about being in space and experiencing the yearning for folks, I think you were talking particularly about being a queer, transgender, non-conforming space for Black folks. That's some of my experience, both for myself and from being in conversation with Black folks, especially in this moment. Like, what is it like? There's so much of a yearning for the space that feels like part of the energy that we have to be able to bring into the room and hold in some way. I don't feel like contain it is the right word. It's not like we want to like hold it in, but the space has to be able to hold that. Like, I've been waiting, and there's so much that's waiting to come out here, and there probably isn't enough space or time to hold everything that needs to be in this space if we were working in a just world. And so just being able to understand that that's there. And then it's like going back and forth, I think I love the description of being able to inhabit the space as well as hold it at the same time, and how working in an imperfection project helps that. Because and you speaking about it too, Parker, that feels like this feels like more required, like maybe it's breaking down the walls of professionalism even more. That one of the things I've been working my head around is I felt the need to locate myself in any conversation more than I ever have in therapy before, because I'm holding so much. Like, if we're having a conversation amongst Black folks about what it's like to hold the witnessing of all this brutality, but also trying to find hope in the uprising and the really nervous, suspicious hope of maybe people are listening, but it's only for a few minutes and who knows how long we have, that I'm holding that as well as everybody else, and having some place where we can have all of that and still do something that's useful enough with each other. So yeah, the language around that feels so necessary. I'm feeling grateful. There's a bunch of spots that really resonated, but I think that piece about how we can like make space for the fullness of our experience, again, talking about how easy it is to fall into pathologizing language, because, and even beyond it, like, I don't think, even just for myself, I don't think that there's no language, there's no even pathologizing language that can hold the depth of my grief and rage and hope and fear. And I know that I'm not the only one in that space. And think about that, that's what our space has to be able to hold, is a bunch of us in the room doing the same thing. Maybe I'll stop there.
Yeah, I hear you, and really appreciate what you shared, Vikki, and the resource you shared with me prior to the conversations I was having with folks, because I do think they need to be fierce, courageous, brave, and compassionate. Because for me, one of the centering pieces is for folks to also have self-compassion, so they can share that compassion with others. So it doesn't mean that we don't, as well, you all are therapists and counselors, but being able to have that sort of moment of grounding and connecting, I think is so vital when people are able to tap into what's going on for them and to allow it to come out. And I think about, the room for struggle that you were talking about, and the imperfection and the repair, and not only keeping our own counsel, but keeping our collective counsel, and what the potential for that is, that the energy that comes into the room and all of its glory and all of its difficulty is what nourishes and grows us. Because if we haven't got the space to be with what's happening, then we can't be with ourselves, and that type of inauthenticity will not serve us. You know, I think too, when we're talking about outing the rage, being able to sort of peel back the layers of, not just intellectually but emotively, what's going on and where does that sit in our bodies, you know, the somatic stuff that people do, and being able to have people talk about where does that show up. And because, you know, I mean, for me, my body's been going through some really bizarre roller coaster rides lately, physically and so on. And so, yeah, being able to have some ways to acknowledge, not so much just to soothe and placate, that it's not really, but to provide comfort, I guess, and connection, and being present. And two, that because, as you said, we have to invite accountability, which I think is one of the big challenges, and the repair for me. And not everybody's going to be able to do it in the moment. Sometimes people have to step back, reflect, and go through their own process to come, you know, well, you know, like what I'm saying is, you know, you know, it makes sense to me, but it's harmful to this other person. So knowing about our intentions, but also being ever mindful of those impacts, and being open to learning, you know, because we're incomplete, and being in these spaces to learn and grow from each other really, for me, means having some porousness around our flexibility, to be present, not just for ourselves, but for each other. And in ways that a capitalist, individualist worldview doesn't support. And patriarchal control of emotions does not support. And, you know, the colonial structures of gender and identity and subjugation, to unshackle ourselves from those things. Yeah. Anyway.
Thanks so much for that. You know, when you were talking about that, I was thinking about decolonizing therapy. Which is an article and a movement really by Mukungu Akinyala and Travis Heath, who's another Black man who's a professor out of Colorado. And I've been, you know, connecting with Travis this last couple of years about him trying to be part of my solidarity team to keep me accountable and offer a critique from his location as a Black academic therapist in my work, which has been so useful. So, I mean, maybe when we post this up, I'll give a link to Mukungu's articles and Travis Heath's articles on that, as well as Ken. But what I'm thinking about when I hear you say this is, I think to be able to deliver what you're hoping for and what you're describing so poetically, I think there, Parker, we need to make sure whoever is facilitating is navigating permission, that we negotiate permission. Like we want to resist rape culture, right? We want to create a consent culture. And so you don't just say, is everybody okay? We're okay. Like every time like we're navigating consent with us all the time. We met for like about an hour beforehand, kind of to consent to this conversation, even though we'd all consented ahead. But in the moment, it might change moment to moment, right? So like that navigating permission's not a commodity. It's not a capitalist commodity. I ask you for your permission, Parker. You say yes, so then I can ask you whatever the fuck I want. Because I have a PhD, which is 27 years of school and a training in arrogance. Like that can really, that's not just white supremacy. It's white supremacy, academic supremacy, like it's all this things battered up. So how do we make sure that we're negotiating permission? And the other thing I think about is thinking about asking people how they're going to leave, and asking them kind of at the beginning how they're going to leave. How's it going to, and asking people, this is informed by Janella Bird from Aotearoa, New Zealand, supervision of me. And she talks a lot about, you know, it's not a safe conversation. This conversation we're having is about trying to structure enough safety to contain and be useful in a conversation. But you can't really structure safety. It's kind of structuring enough safety. That's Janella Bird's idea, right? How do we create enough safety? Is it safe enough to go ahead? Not is it perfectly safe? But part of that is, how are you going to be safe after this? When everybody leaves each other in this conversation, how are you going to care for yourself, for your others, for each other? How are we going to integrate, how are we going to get back to a place where we're not going to, suffer greater for having spoken our truth? Like, how do we structure that into the telling? So I think that's part of permission, navigating the permission and structuring the safety is acknowledging it's not safe. It is unsafe, or Black people would be raging out in the street. There's a reason it is not safe. It is life-threatening. You can be killed. Like, we need to take this very seriously. This is not a metaphor, right? And so thinking about that, and then thinking about, how are you going to leave? How are you going to take care of yourself afterwards? And then also, I have these ideas about solidarity teams. Who's in solidarity with you? Whether you can bring them in real or imagined to hold you for this. And I think you need a howl at the moon person. That's my new academic thing. It's a real thing now, howling at the moon. You need somebody you can howl at the moon with when you feel that you are going to possibly, it might get judged as you losing your containment, but actually it's something else. You need someone you have a prior agreement with, that that Sacha could call me, or I could call Sacha. And that if I could, I would come, because I like what you're saying, Parker. The body matters, right? The trauma does land in the body. If I could come embodied, I would come. But otherwise, that Sacha, would know that he could tell me anything. He might sound homicidal. He might sound suicidal. He might sound crazy. He might sound depressed. He might, when I say crazy, I mean psychotic. But that my response is not trying to do a suicide checklist, find out where he is and get a cop, send for another cop wellness check. You got to have somebody that you speak with ahead of time, because you're going to maybe scare them. So don't scare them. Set it up ahead of time and say, can you hold this rage? Can you hold this heartbreak? Can you hold this powerlessness? Can you hold this for me? And create that relationship ahead of time, so that when we need to howl at the moon, we're not looking for, who the hell can I call? Who's not going to cop me? Who's not going to psychoanalyze me? Who's not going to start, who's not going to get the ambulance here because I'm suicidal? When I say I can't do this anymore, who's not going to start to get a suicide checklist out, Especially because with stuff like mental health first aid, and the beautiful language you had, Parker, the way people feel that they're being deputized to be cops, but they're also feeling like they've been deputized and somehow to be each other's, everybody's a mental health counselor now, and every issue is mental illness. And the response to that, because we haven't defunded the police, is if you call, you're going to get a cop. You're not going to get Sacha showing up, right? So I'm thinking about these ways as the person that's trying to hold the space, how they can think about these kind of things. And the other thing I'm thinking about is peopling the room for safety. Inviting people at the very beginning as part of structuring enough safety. Who do you need to bring in with you spiritually, in the embodied way? I'm Irish. I have no problem bringing my grandmother with me. She passed when I was 7. She's with me all the time. How do you people the room with someone? Who do you need to bring with you that would help you be here in a good way, experience more safety and more solidarity, and possibly, make this a more useful conversation for people? And I think of Kathy Richardson, who's Métis, and she and I co-wrote an article on structuring safety around work with people who are residential school survivors, who we know are just survivors of torture and political violence from the state. But one of the things Kathy did is she was talking to an Indigenous woman about these ideas about a solidarity team. And this Indigenous woman was going to give testimony in court. So they went ahead of time and they had a smudge. And then she imagined, she peopled the room with one of her ancestors in every chair in the courtroom. So it was absolutely full of her people the next day when she walked in. This is what I mean by peopling the room. And Kathy shared that story in our article. So it's not an appropriated story, it's a shared story. But so I'm thinking about, when you're the person trying to facilitate this or hold the space for other folks, how are you structuring safety? How are you negotiating permission? How are we acknowledging it's not safe, it's going to be safe enough? How are we already helping people to leave before we have this experience? And how are we helping people bring more resources, more folks, more collective care in terms of this solidarity team, and someone to howl with the moon with? Because I don't think it's ethical or responsible to think about this as one conversation that's going to get closed somehow. That whole psychological you know, that you're gonna, like you said, catharsis, we're gonna get over it or something. Yeah.
That's so lovely. Things I keep really appreciating is that I have the sense that you're both giving words to some of the pieces that I'm trying, that in my own head though been trying to work through and make sense of. And one of the things that both of you are talking about that I've been thinking a bunch about is what are the specificities of some of these conversations, that we're not just talking about having a conversation amongst Black folks in any time, in any place. We're talking about what it is to have conversations amongst Black folks here in this moment. And there's pieces that Parker that make me think about that, you know, we're doing this in a complex conversation with isolation as part of that, because there's already isolation. We live in a society that creates isolation, but also we live in a community that's predominantly white and that is deeply white supremacist. And so there's an isolation in that. You know, we're in the midst of pandemic, which has imposed different kinds of isolations on everybody. And so, yeah, just naming that that's in the room, and it's one of the things we're trying to work through. And then, you know, one of the other pieces I've been thinking through is, what does it mean to be in conversations amongst Black folks here in this place, that where there are not predominantly Black communities or spaces. And some of that is historic in the disappearance of Hogan's Alley. Also part of it is just demographic in terms of numbers. That, you know, my experience, I haven't lived in a city, in a community where there are large scale, predominantly Black spaces. So, you know, I can't exactly compare to that, but one of the things I think about and encounter with myself and encountering conversation with folks that makes me think about, Vikki, you're talking about around safe, what's it going to be like after you leave here, is that even in Black spaces, white spaces are in the periphery. That for most Black folks, we're in, you know, even in spaces, in Black conversations, we're going back out into white spaces after we leave this conversation. And so that's a particular kind of lack of safety that we're going to need to be able to hold and navigate when we leave these conversations. And so that, you know, that conversation around like, how are you going to be after you leave here feels especially pointed, because it may be Black here, but don't let that fool you into imagining that it's Black out there, because it's still going to be white. It's still going to be non-Black. There's still going to be that deep anti-Blackness that we're going to have to be able to negotiate and put on, again, whatever armor, and doesn't feel like the right metaphor, but put on whatever we need to be able to hold ourselves to go back out into those places. And we don't want to let the conversation is going to be more unsafe if we trick ourselves into believing that what we experience here is going to be possible out there. Yeah. And then just, you know, naming quickly that similar piece around that howling at the moon person, that just feels like it's something, I know it's language that Vikki have been working through for a little bit, but feels like it has such a different meaning now that we're all becoming more and more aware of how sending a wellness check on somebody is basically entertaining their violent death. And so we need to be able to really hold that. And so if you're howling at the moon with somebody, we need to know that it's not going to be, your life isn't going to be at risk because of it. And also maybe a little bit more something that, a piece that I think maybe Parker, you're talking around, that I'm trying to think about just as our shared location as cis Black men, that comes for the Howling at the Moon person, that it does feel like there is a place around our rage and our anger as cis Black men, where there's certainly a place for Black outrage and rage, but also that, you know, we're also inhabiting patriarchy. And so there does need to be some awareness that our rage is going to impact folks, that we are enacting male rage, and that's something else. And so it can't just be released on the people around us. And so even just that sense of having a place where it's negotiated, where it's safer or safe enough, feels like it also speaks to that need that yeah, it feels like you've both been sort of touching on pieces of. So yeah, all of it just feels so, you know, you're talking in really beautiful large language, but it feels like so practical and necessary on the ground, imagining what the like actual nuts and bolts of being in these conversations here in this moment with folks.
I really appreciate what you shared there, Sacha, and the way that you put it, because I think particularly the last bit around dismantling patriarchy and being aware of misogynoir and transphobia and the ways in which things like Islamophobia and other issues around our own diversity within, because people, have heard the phrase "skin folk aren't always kinfolk," and so the the challenges of that, and the complexities, of holding that, and for me too, just the different cultural contexts that people are coming from, the range of diversity of and the ways in which we who describe ourselves as Black come from. People come from places where before getting here, they weren't Black. They were Kikuyu. They were, they're Haitian. They're whoever, however that is. And, white supremacy is a global phenomenon, but how it shows up in post-colonial, decolonial, other kinds of contexts is very different. And so, certainly being open to that range of diversity and language, allowing people to speak in the languages that are comfortable for them, and not always, and knowing that translation isn't always necessary, because I think about like church, when people start speaking in tongues and be like, okay, Aunt Frida's getting ready to go off, and you just kind of have space for that, and no judgment. It's just, this is what it is. This is how the spirit is engaged this individual, and roll with that. And for people, for those of us who are unfamiliar with some of these behaviors, it can be rather shocking or discomforting, and being able to let people know that this is going to be uncomfortable, and uncomfortable is not always unsafe. And so being able to create the space for that, and non-closure that's going to happen with that, because I do think that the container is really important, but I also think of, because we always use the language of container, sort of having walls and support, but increasingly I start wondering, are we really talking about a container, or are we just talking about a space, so that it's not so much about so you want to be able to write on the walls in the space, you want to bring all your colors and contribute, make your contributions, and note each of these things as a gift, and collectively we're going to be making something together, so each person's making their contribution. People, like in church sometimes, or context in which I grew up, people pass the hat, and folks would make their contributions and sort of to the collective goodwill. I started to think about these gatherings of people making their contribution to the collective well-being of the community, and whatever that contribution is, and however it shows up. So yeah, but and leaving, I think, is really important. And Sacha, you spoke to it very well, that it's Black faces and white spaces, and so we know that we are surrounded by and inhabited by these oppressive structures, and I really like to think about going into these spaces as liberatory spaces, and to take that liberatory space back out with us into the larger space, so that we're constantly expanding and living into that liberatory space that we seek. Anyway, that's me.
That's beautiful. I think that's a beautiful way to end it, Parker. Thanks so much for everything you brought, and Sacha for being here. Really appreciate both of you trusting me enough to have this conversation, and I'm hoping it's useful.
Absolutely. Thank you. It was, lovely.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Was that a wrap?